Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential global and national leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. COVID-19 is a world event. Only a handful of countries have reported no instances of the virus. And even as it blazes such a wide and destructive path, some have posted that instead of slowing down terrorist threats, this scourge may in fact ramp up efforts to destabilize the world and the United States. One leader of a venerable think tank says the bad guys aren't waiting on the coronavirus to attack us. She went on to say that rogue actors and governments continue to think about how to destabilize or harm the United States. She names names: Russia, Iran, North Korea, and more. And she points to a reemergence of terror groups in Europe. To expand on that is my next guest, a good friend, Jane Harman, who has served 9 times in the U.S. Congress and was as former Democratic U.S. Representative for California's 36th Congressional District. She's now the Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Jane, thank you for joining me today. Let's just get at it. I mean, this is a time which is fascinating. So much pain, so much struggle, so much hardship, but you've got players out there exploiting the moment, both politically here in Washington and internationally. But let's focus on the national security side of it first. What most worries you? What do you see out there about those trying to exploit this moment and to cause increasing troubles for the United States?
I think it's a long list. You hinted at many of them, but let's start with North Korea, which claims not to have any COVID cases. Yeah, right. Where the leader disappeared for 3 weeks, but he's back, and there's no indication that they aren't continuing to test short and medium range missiles, which could be armed with nuclear warheads, which could hit our allies like South Korea and Japan. And they also have longer range missiles, by the way. So let's go there. Let's go to Iran, where the centrifuges are turning again after we got out of the 2015 nuclear deal. I think it was a mistake to get out, and I think they have license to, and they're taking advantage of it to restart their nuclear industry there. That's 2. We have a couple of failed states like Yemen. I don't know what we call the Palestinians these days, but certainly they're unhappy, and we have denied them aid, and there could be an uprising there. Syria is another one on my list of failed and failing states. The Sahel of Africa. How long do we have, Steve? I could go on, but let's also talk about a domestic terror attack. I mean, people can self-radicalize on the internet in their basement. We all understand this. And the weapons of choice these days are trucks or vans and knives or guns, and guns are plentiful. So I see this happening. And finally, I see some immigrants, they're not all refugees, but immigrants getting into Europe. Maybe they were Europeans who claimed allegiance to ISIS, and doing things like the effort in France a couple of weeks ago with several, where several people were killed near Lyon.
You know, one of the other things that you wrote about in The Hill recently was the debate over John Ratcliffe for the role as director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And he had made a point saying that one of the priorities that he came into was to look at the origins of the coronavirus virus and to look specifically at the Wuhan Lab. And you confessed in that piece that said, hey, I've been here before. This is what happened with the invasion of Iraq. This is what happened with WMD. We've got to be careful. And you said, can we trust this guy? Tell us more.
Well, I don't know what he's looked at, but my understanding from publicly reported sources is at least 12 presidential daily briefed the president, this president, in January and February on the possible coronavirus threat to the United States. Those briefings were ignored. So let's start with that. What I'm talking about is in the run-up to war with Iraq. I was there. I was ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee at the time. There was enormous pressure on the intelligence community to produce proof that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, everybody knew Saddam wanted to develop WMDs, and he did have certainly a chemical industry going on there. He had gassed his own people, and so we all understood that. But the pressure produced a wrong national intelligence estimate. Now what I see is pressure on the IC, where we've had huge turnover in leadership. Ratcliffe would come in. He's been nominated to be Director of National Intelligence. He hasn't been confirmed yet. but huge, some call it a purge at the top and enormous pressure. And if the pressure is to produce proof that there was a man-made virus developed and distributed in the Wuhan lab, no proof for that I'm aware of, then we'll come up with another wrong intelligence product that could lead to another misguided war.
When you look at the decision making that's going on around the president and the struggle right now with science, if you will, science, empirical research, the kind of data that comes in, and there does seem to be a tug of war, and there almost seems to be, a partisan divide over how that material is dealt with. Do you worry about that?
Sure, I do. I don't know. It's probably a partisan divide in Washington because everything's a partisan divide in Washington. But when you look at what the states are doing and the efforts of governors, both Democrats and Republicans, I don't see that kind of divide. I have a kind of personal heroes list. Of course, my own governor is Gavin Newsom of California, but Andrew Cuomo's doing well. Mike DeWine, who was a friend of mine in Congress, governor of Ohio, a Republican's doing great. Larry Hogan, another Republican's doing great. These are governors of pretty big states trying to figure out how to have both, protect the health of their citizens and have an economy that will be able to function in a fairly near term while protecting the health of their citizens. And that's what they're doing. So I just want to give a shout out to most of the governors. They all seem to be very sensible to me.
Well, you're in Washington, you're on a big think tank with smart people, and you served in Congress for a long time. Recently, I interviewed Senator Joe Manchin, and he just basically blew up and he said, we've eviscerated the funding to the NIH, we've eviscerated funding to the CDC in these key vaccine areas. We had warnings of a future pandemic of enormous consequence, and some like Senator Chris Coons have said, it's still coming. This is a foreshock.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the ecosystem here and what it will take from your perspective. If there's a Washington player that par excellence, that I know it's you, what will it take to actually invest in the protection and the infrastructure and the investment in science that we need for this pandemic and the next one?
Well, let's start with leadership. Leadership that wants to solve the problem, not just blame leadership on the other side for not solving the problem. And it's hard for leaders in Congress to show leadership. I would give my Girl Scout badge to Nancy Pelosi, who worked very closely with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin on the last big bill, the multi-trillion-dollar bill, which is providing some aid for a lot of folks. I'm listening. I don't have specific information, but I'm listening to the chairman of the Fed yesterday saying we need more. And let's have bipartisan leadership focus on what the next tranche should be. I take seriously the ballooning, exploding deficit. I think it's a real problem for national security, American security going forward. But I also think it won't matter if we have a big deficit if we have a lot of dead people and no economy.
What do you think some of your former colleagues in the Democratic Party haven't gotten right as they've stepped forward? You're kind of like an pox on every house type of person, very candid and honest. What have they screwed up on that they could do?
Oh, I'm not a pox on every house kind of person. But there's potential in every person kind of person.
Yeah.
And I moved to the Wilson Center on my own, on my own feet, because it's a bipartisan oasis focused on generating good solutions to policy problems. What'll it take? Somebody has to say, and a few do, and I bet Joe Manchin's one of those. I'm going to put the country first. This is a problem. The COVID virus, this invisible enemy, to quote our president, doesn't choose us by party affiliation. So if we don't put the country first here, again, we're going to have a lot of dead people and a dead economy. And that is just how it is. And so I would say to my constituents, and I had a pretty bipartisan district all those years, I would say to my constituents, this is what I think. I would be willing to talk to any of them, but I would take a risk and do what I thought was the right thing, regardless of which party I was voting with or working with.
You know, we had an election a few years ago, and we got an election around the corner. And that election, a lot of the drama was about Russian meddling electronically.
Yeah.
In the election, we've seen an uptick not only of Russia, but of other cyber meddling going on across the board. And there have been worries about that. How prepared or unprepared are we, in your eyes, for the November election and this worry about outside meddling?
Well, I'm worried about it. I think we're better prepared than we were in 2018, for sure, or 2016. And shout out to the Department of Homeland Security, which is working well with all the states. Let's understand the states regulate the time and manner of elections. We don't have a national election. We have 50 state elections. But they are working with the federal government. Just before the end of the Obama administration, election machinery and the election process was declared critical infrastructure, which it is, and so that's good. Also, a shout out to some states like mine, California, which is going to all mail, MAIL, not MALE voting, and I think that's a good thing. It obviously has to be worked on so that it can't be manipulated, but let's expect that Russia and others will try to be there. And let's understand that we have a way to go, and we have technology that could go there to make vote by mail election secure. Another reason to do that, by the way, Steve, of course, is if we have COVID-19 in our fall, which is predicted, or some permutation, which is even worse, God forbid, people are not going to go to polling places. And I heard that Jared Kushner, this could be an urban legend, said, well, then maybe we won't have an election. Well, oops, I don't think that's the White House's call. I think our Constitution provides that we have elections for president and other offices every 4 years, and the states have to regulate that. And I think most of our states, I would hope all of our states, are up to that.
In our last couple of minutes, Jane, I'd like to ask you, you've represented and you know a lot of people in the technology area, both the defense and intelligence side and the non-defense side. I interviewed Secretary Ernest Moniz yesterday, and he has this idea of an energy jobs coalition in the future, and that we're going to have to think big. We're going to need a TVA, a CCC. We're going to have to put people back to work. And the notion is that we advance the American economy, move it forward, and invest in it. Just don't recover. Recovering is not enough. I'd love to get your insights as a sculptor of big legislation in the past. How should we be thinking of it? Is Ernie Moniz on the right track? Where are you on tech and what it can do to sort of rebuild our social contract in America?
Well, I think tech is no longer optional, if it ever was. Even I have learned how to sort of kind of work Zoom and do a few other things that I never thought I could do. But I think the future of work is going to be much more technology based. I think not everyone's going back to an office. So let's start with that. I think that, to quote Rahm Emanuel, let's not let a crisis go to waste. This crisis could be an accelerator of bad things. That is, more dictators controlling more of their countries, or it could be an accelerator of good things. And that is using technology to build jobs of the future in the energy sector. Certainly, that's one, but climate is a gigantic challenge. But also jobs in the national security sector and in the healthcare sector. All of this stuff could benefit from technology. I've just been watching another shout out, Ken Burns' series on the Roosevelts, and how Franklin Roosevelt, at the darkest time before this time, developed all these new agencies, the ones you were talking about, which jump-started our economy. And then came a war. Let's not start another war. He didn't start World War II. And the defense production business lifted millions out of unemployment. So I'm not recommending war, but I am recommending taking on the big challenges that we know we face and doing exactly what Ernie Moniz says.
Well, with that, we'll leave it there. Wilson Center President, former U.S. House Representative Jane Harman, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of you watching, thank you for joining me today. I'm Steve Clemons. We'll see you next week. Be well.